Hello. Um, Welcome to the second um, presentation in the webinar series. Today we will be talking about how to develop forecasts, and we'll give you a general overview. My name is Allison Campbell. I'm from PNNL, and joining me are JP Carvalho from Lawrence Berkeley Lab and Brittany Tarafelli from PNNL. First, we'd like to acknowledge the funding from the DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Energy Grid Integration, Vehicle Technologies Office, Building Technology Office, Solar, Cybersecurity, and Electricity and Grid Deployment Office. So I mentioned that this is the second presentation in our web series overview. You previously heard from Juliet and Iran on an overview of the whole series. And over the coming weeks, you'll learn more about forecasts in greater detail, and that'll go towards the implications on resource accreditation and resource adequacy. So with that, we'll start the presentation on developing forecasts. In this presentation, we'd like for you to know that our objective is to demystify basic forecasting methods, their application at both the bulk power system and distribution system levels, and how they feed into utility decision-making. I'm going to be giving an introduction to electricity forecasting. JP is going to talk about the distribution system and the bulk power system. And Brittany is going to talk about best practices and how these forecasts feed into utility decision-making. With that, we'll dive into an introduction into electricity forecasting. So when it comes to developing an electricity forecast, it's important to think about all the stages. What are the components of an electricity forecast? If we break those down, that can be broken into inputs, methods, and outputs. So we'll talk about these in greater detail. The inputs for electricity forecasts can be things on the order of spatial aggregation, the time frame, the variables inputs we want to include, the purpose of the forecast, and the algorithm or the method that itself can be an input. Methodologies are derived from statistics and physics. We'll talk about those in greater depth. And then in terms of outputs, specifically for regulatory and utility decision-making, we want to look at like annual energy, peak demand, hourly load profiles, and I'll show you some examples of those. In the top right, I have an example, like a little chevron diagram to show you where we are in the process, so that if you're asking yourself along the way, what part are we talking about? Where does this apply? Then you can see. So, right, for example, right now we're talking about utility electricity forecast inputs. So some of these questions we want to ask ourselves are: what is the spatial aggregation? What is the time frame? So for spatial aggregation, we can look at the balancing authority. So we could be looking at the whole balancing authority. We could also be looking at individual customer classes. So within that balancing authority, maybe we just want to look at the residential customers, or just the commercial customers, just the industrial customers. We could also just be looking at an individual feeder. We could also just be looking at an individual building or a set of buildings. And knowing that aggregation is going to impact how we develop the forecast. For the time frame, that's important as well. We could be looking at an operational forecast, so something for tomorrow, like a day ahead operational forecast, or a planning forecast, something that would be used more for resource adequacy. A planning forecast could be, what is my peak demand next year? Or what is my peak demand 10 years from now? Maybe it's my peak demand for my balancing authority 10 years from now. The variables that are the most important for electricity forecasts can be temperature, time cycles, like every month or every week, every day. You know, we have humans, we operate on cycles. Demography. So in some areas of your balancing authority, there might be different patterns as opposed to other areas. And economics. So this would be like your adoption of different technologies and your general GDP growth over time. We also need to consider how complex do we want to make the forecast method. Sometimes complexity can be very good. For example, if you are thinking about adopting different AI approaches, that can be very helpful, but it might not always be needed. Often the more simplistic approaches are also the most robust and the easier to explain to regulators. Um, so you can also consider for a specific utility, what capacity does that utility or that entity that's building the forecast, what capacity does it have to build a more complex forecast? Does their forecast even need to be advanced, or does a simpler or a traditional approach, is that sufficient? And then finally, what's the purpose of the forecast? Does the utility need to upgrade a feeder? Meaning, do they need to forecast the peak loads below the feeder? Does the utility need to consider more base load power? For example, are there more data center customers that are likely to be interconnecting? So in greater detail, we can look at spatial aggregation. The visualization on the right is that of your transmission and distribution utility. If we look at the different types of aggregation, let's look for a moment at the distribution feeder. I've circled everything that is below the distribution substation to give you an idea of everything that would be included in our forecast of, for example, loads below the distribution station. So this would be all of the customers below there. But if we want to just forecast the loads of an individual customer class, perhaps we just want to forecast the residential customers, then we are only considering those individual customers. And below that, we could be considering residential and commercial separately. So could look at the number of customers in each class or the usage even per customer. For industrial customers, the forecasting is often individual to each customer because industrial customers typically have either set schedules where they have they're predetermined on-off cycles, or it's something where they're very typically large loads, and so the utility understands or has a relationship with that customer. The more important thing when it comes to forecasting is the entry and exit of those large customers. So that would be following the market trends. We can also look at disaggregated forecasts, which can be done separately and then aggregated to the necessary level. That would mean doing a monthly customer class forecast, then aggregated to annual by customer class, or a monthly customer class aggregated to monthly at the balancing authority level. In terms of time frame, we are looking now at what time frames are relevant for different purposes. So on the energy trading timescale, forecasts can incorporate greater detail about the month of the year and the impact of temperature on demand for specific customer classes. This visualization I have on the left here shows us the dominance of the different approaches, meaning the different methodologies for forecasts based on the forecast timescale. So as we go towards the shorter timescales, this goes down to the second timescales, but let's consider it more the hourly timescales. The approaches that we would take would be more dominated by bottom-up approaches, stochastic or physics-based approaches. And then as we go to the longer time frame scales, we would be looking at methodologies that are driven more by top-down overall trends and economics based. So that's why for this short time scale, we're looking more at bottom up. So I mentioned specific customer classes and the impact of temperature on those specific customer classes. So on the system planning and policy timescale, but these forecasts are largely built from overall trend of the system peak and load growth. These are those top-down and economics-based approaches. An example of the output here is peak demand in megawatts But you can see that the units on the bottom are by year. So this is very top down and overall trend, and then the annual energy as well. Finally, let's look for a moment at the different variables that are relevant for forecasts. This plot shows a very well understood trend between load and temperature. It's called this like or knee or hockey stick trend, but there's like a bend in the middle. That bend is typically at your either heating degree days or cooling degree days. And so we can even break up the dependence of your load on temperature and make it a piecewise linear relationship. The point here is that the variables have a strong correlation with your forecast. So temperature is very important, one of the most important, especially for load forecasting. Cyclic factors, so that's weekday, weekend, holidays, hour of the day, month of the year, anything that's cyclic like that. Demographic factors like population growth and household size as well. So you can think about incorporating data from, for example, your census information. And then economic factors like employment, energy efficiency trends, GDP, adoption of appliances, and then also sometimes price elasticity. This is a very small number. So the values for price elasticity typically range between 0 and negative 0.2. And that means that customers will switch to using other types of energy if prices increase, but only substantially increase. So let's look for a moment. My colleague JP has a publication from several years ago, which looked at the dominant variables that were incorporated into utility load forecasts in their IRPs. So we can see here that some of the most common variables are historical sales. So those would be looking at your previous sales, cooling degree days, heating degree days, population growth, electricity prices, employment. So you can see that for the most part, these are the variables that are important in electricity forecasting. Let's move on to algorithms and methods. In that same report that JP has, he also looked at the usage of different methodologies for forecasting across different utilities. The most common approaches that are used for forecasting are econometric or time series regression. Econometric and time series regression approaches primarily rely on past observations. This means that they are regressing on themselves. That's what the auto means in auto-regressive. And there's also components called moving average. I'm going to explain that again in a few slides, but just know that for the most part, we are looking at past observations. We can also incorporate exogenous variables. Exogenous just means that it's not it's not a previous observation, it's an additional variable. We can look at any type of variable. So for example, we can look at nonlinear variables that are influenced by the economy, such as GDP, household income, and also S-curve for energy efficiency or appliance adoption. Another approach that's commonly used is multiple linear regression. This relies primarily on cross-sectional variables. So this means like the number of customers, GDP, the day of the week. You can also combine all of these approaches, but these are the primary approaches. Multiple linear regression is similar to your vanilla linear regression. So, y equals mx plus b. It's just imagine that instead of, so m is your variable, or x is your variable, and m is your slope. Now imagine you have another x with another variable. So we have, let's say, the number of customers, and then plus the GDP, plus the day of the week. So all of these variables, and then you minimize your regression. Also, we look at bottom-up engineering or physics-based approaches. I'll have a quick example about what that means. We can additionally make some adjustments to the forecast for specific end uses. And then finally, I mentioned that we can combine these forecasts in a whole slew of ways, but ultimately a simple combination can also be very helpful. All of these approaches are used by by different utilities in different ways. But what might be more helpful to think about is under what conditions do we use these approaches? So when we think about a time series or econometric methodology, when would we be thinking about that? That would be in use by all types of utilities, but it's often used by customer class to look at specific adoption. So in there, we would be fitting an autoaggressive or moving average model to an annual peak. The economic variables will be incorporated with an S-curve. Multiple linear regression is used almost everywhere. That's often one of the easiest first approaches to take. And then the dominant approaches would be to incorporate a trend variable, which just means that we expect the forecast, we expect the electricity load, for example, to grow over time. We don't know how much. In fact, it could be a negative growth. It's just that trend incorporates the assumption that we're not going to stay static over time. So we allow that to grow. And then daily trends, monthly trends, and temperature. Those are the most dominant variables. And here's an example of what I mean by that linear regression, multiple linear regression. End use is most widely used for mid to large utilities to model building level equipment. So this would be solar, EV, and other distributed resources. So here we would have a regression for each type of customer and their equipment. So customers, the units of equipment per customer, things like that. And then for ensemble or combined approaches, this would be like your larger utilities looking to improve the results of the forecast by combining their approaches. One of the most effective ways to improve your forecast is to take very, very different approaches. So let's say we can use a time series econometric approach, a multiple linear regression with some assumptions, an end use with different assumptions, and then taking a simple average. That can often be the most powerful way to improve your forecast. So let's discuss in greater detail what an econometric or time series forecast means. So an econometric forecast can be decomposed into cyclic trends and overall trends. If you're interested in learning more about the details and the statistics behind forecasts, the note here on the bottom is a link to an online free text. And this visualization shows you that your whole time series can be broken down into, so let's say the one on the top is your total historical component. And then that can be broken down into a trend, so you can even see visually that it moves over time. So if we were to subtract out the trend, what would be left with is your seasonality. And then if we subtract the seasonality from that, then we have a remainder. And then we could say, okay, I know I can model the trend pretty well. I can model the seasonality pretty well. Now all I have to do is model the remainder. So it's these different ways of breaking down a time series and making it easier to model. These cycles account for weekly, monthly, and yearly repetition. The approach that's used for modeling these in this way is called ARIMA. This is an acronym which stands for Autoregressive Integrated Moving Average, and I'm going to talk about what that means in greater detail in the next slide. But before I do that, I just wanted to also mention that you can also incorporate exogenous economic variables and any kind of exogenous variable, so long as it's a time series variable. And when you do that, it's called RE max, just so you know the terminology if you see this in a forecast. So you can also incorporate customer growth using per capita incomes, employment levels, electricity prices. All these additional variables can be added to your model. So ARIMA uses information from past observations to predict the future. You can think of this as building a regression model using only past observations. That's the autoregressive part here. I've broken this down into a little dummy model on the bottom. So imagine that on the left, we have an autoregressive. So autoregressive just means, imagine again, y equals mx plus b. Let's say we want to predict y by using y minus 1. So y equals m times whatever y used to be plus 1. And it's a little funny to wrap your head around, but that's effectively what it means. And there's ways of manipulating the algebra or whatever. But ultimately, we're just saying like, okay, I know what the last value was, and if I were to fit a line to that, what would my next value be? That's what autoregressive means. Moving average means that the next value will be an average of all of the previous several values. You could have it be a moving average of the last 10 values, a moving average of the last 2 values, a moving average of the last 88, 7, 60 values. That's a moving average because then you move forward, let's say one space or one time period, and then you take another average and say, okay, well, my next one is going to be an average of these values. We can put them together, and then we can also add additional variables. And then that is our ARIMA. Technically, this is ARMA because I haven't incorporated the integrated part, but if you want to learn more about that, I would suggest looking at the text I mentioned on the past slide. Okay, let's move into bottom-up engineering and physics-based approaches. Let's say you're more of an electrical engineer, and you tell yourself, now, wait a minute, we've been talking about statistics-based approaches. That's all fine and good. But I know that I can model like a three-phase transformer, and I know what all of these, electrical engineering things do and mean, and I know about losses. So why don't I just model the physics of it? Well, you can. You just need to think about, where does it make sense to do that? A lot of the times, the place it makes the most sense to do this is when you're modeling a feeder, or you want to incorporate the impacts of price-sensitive appliances on your hourly energy usage because you want to model all of those individual appliances. So it's at the very small level. Or maybe you want to model system losses. Maybe you want to simulate the power flow of the system. Or maybe you want to model the operation of the PVs and the batteries at the household level. So to do this, there are a few tools available. One of them is GridLabD, which is developed by PNNL. Another one is OpenDSS, which is provided by EPRI. They're both very similar tools. They do the same thing. But what we can do here is we can model, for example, a load shape. I have here on the top left, load shape for a single family home on one day, purely based on a knowledge of the appliances in the household and the physics of the electricity grid. And on the right, this is a one line diagram for, it has 4 houses, but it's meant to illustrate 10 detailed residential customers with a distribution transformer hooked up to grid equipment. So what would the time series of the load be under these very, very specific components? So that is another approach one can take. And then perhaps you would like to modify your end use model. To do this, this is for directly estimating energy consumption by using extensive information about the end use and the end users. So there's often a number of surveys that have been done about end users and the end uses. If you maybe you would like to glean some information about technology adoption, and then the impacts of the age of the equipment, size of the houses, customer behavior, population dynamics. This approach requires less historical data, but it requires more information about customers and their equipment. The one drawback here is that it can be sensitive to the amount and the quality of the end use data. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then finally, probabilistic and scenario-based approaches are growing in popularity. These are created predominantly by changing the input variables. So I want everyone here to walk away with an understanding that probabilistic forecasts are not so difficult. You can create a probabilistic forecast primarily by changing your assumptions. That's why I've called this also scenario-based. So a good example here would be that perhaps a utility needs to project their peak demand by customer class, starting with their residential customers, and they know that the residential customers are highly sensitive to temperature. So if you want to project your peak demand, maybe you want to project your peak demand 10 years from now. We can say a lot of things about the temperature, but for the most part, we don't know. We know the temperature 7 days from now. We don't know it a month from now. We don't know it 10 years from now. But we do have a reasonable idea about what the, like, let's say within the ballpark of reasonable, the highest temperature could be, and within the ballpark of reasonable, what the lowest temperature could be. So we would start with your TMY your TMY temperature. This is your typical meteorological year, which really just means that it's an average of the meteorological years in the past. So this would be your base case. Like if we were to assume average temperatures, then this is, middle of the road. And then we could pick a representative cold weather year to project a low scenario for load, and then a representative hot weather year to project a high scenario for load. And then we run that temperature, and it's a new assumption, it's a new scenario, through our forecasting model, and then we get a new output each time. We get 3 outputs. That is a probabilistic forecast. And then, of course, we can do this in a lot of different ways, but that is one example. Because the point here is that the scenario outcomes provide a range of possible futures. Now we'll touch on forecast outputs. We're getting to the end here. So some common outputs would be your annual energy and peak demand. These are often used by utilities to inform your planning reserve margins, which would be used in development of your resource adequacy models. Your hourly customer usage throughout the year. So this is the daily profile and one profile for each month. These hourly profiles by customer class can show utilities the impacts of resource adoption, especially over time. So with the probabilistic forecasts, such as your high and low scenarios for peak demand growth, these provide a range of outcomes also with the probability of occurrence. You would mostly see these within the realm of resource adequacy. These Rubik's cubes on the bottom right indicate each tiny box indicates a single scenario. So imagine that like the one red box in the big box on the bottom left, that is your entire data set with 8760 of temperature, of solar production, of everything you could ever imagine you would need for one analysis. So each tiny box produces one forecast. Now imagine we have 40 weather years, different hydrology scenarios, different load growth scenarios, and then we have hundreds to thousands of scenarios that we can run. So probabilistic results are driven by uncertainty in the inputs. If we don't know what the inputs are going to be, then we want to permute the inputs in a way that we think is reasonable. So resource adequacy, I mentioned, leverages scenario-based hourly projections of load and generation to ensure that demand is met for all hours, allowing for typically a 1 day in 10 years with any shortfall. And then, so finally, let's go through some forecast components by their application. I'm not gonna read all of these in detail, but I'm gonna call out a few, and then I think folks have the slides, so you can read these in greater detail. So for longer time frames and longer forecast horizons, these must manage typically less information. This results in aggregating to larger areas, like your balancing authority or your feeder, and using methods that depend on fewer external variables. Because you can imagine if you have a long horizon forecast into 10 years in the future, you have to make you either have to make some assumptions about your external variables like population growth, economic growth, or temperatures, or you have to, come to the conclusion that you just don't know the answer and you have to make an educated guess or take an average. Applications like resource adequacy, which require detailed information, these need to rely on scenarios of the input variables, because then we want to have a very good estimate of the results. For shorter timeframes and horizons, these can take advantage of richer data sets because we have more information. This allows utilities to build models for each customer class and even for buildings at a very, very detailed level. So with that, I'm going to close and then pass it off to my colleague, JP.
Thanks, Alison. Great presentation, and really glad to be here. Alison gave a really deep, detailed overview on forecasting practices, techniques, and methods. And I'm going to take this now into a direct application, how and why there might be some differences in forecasting methods and techniques for distribution systems versus bulk power systems. Next slide. So first of all, just so we're all super clear, let's take a look at the entire value chain of the power system and make sure that we understand that there is a historically historical division between what's called the bulk power system that entails generation and high voltage transmission infrastructure, and then the distribution system, which is typically the poles that we see outside our houses and in our cities that have typically 13 kV, sometimes 25 kV, medium voltage, and then drop downs to the 240 or 110 volts that reach people's homes and commerce. There are specific differences between how these two systems work and how they have to be planned that justify quite important differences in the forecasting techniques that we're going to see in the next slide. So if you're going to take anything from my presentation today, is this particular table that kind of highlights the differences between forecasts developed for bulk power systems versus forecasts developed for distribution systems. I'm going to go row by row, kind of highlighting different elements here. In the bulk power system, it typically relies in aggregated load representations. The bulk power system is very big. It encompasses sometimes an entire state or multiple states. And in doing this, it can't represent load at a very granular level, or it doesn't need to historically. And so it usually develops specific nodes. Sometimes those nodes are very large transmission substations and aggregates the underlying load that connects to that node up and represented at that level. In contrast, the distribution system has and requires highly localized load forecast because it's trying to represent very specific behaviors of specific customers within a feeder or within a service territory. These forecasts require much more detailed information about which customers are represented in the forecast, and eventually what types of end uses are being used by those customers, as Alison mentioned, in the specifically to feed into end use based load forecasting. On the second point here, the aggregation of large loads allow to reflect diversity benefits inherently. So as we have, for example, people in one city going to bed earlier and people in our city going to bed later, that would reflect different patterns of use in a temporal basis that could be averaged out. And it also averages out outliers and errors. The fact that we're bringing everything up makes everything look more normal from a statistical perspective. On the other hand, the distribution system has the benefit and the curse that the forecast will want to reflect idiosyncrasies. We want to reflect those specific behaviors that are characteristic of local areas, local neighborhoods, not even cities, but portions of cities, and then do not reflect necessarily diversity. They're made by individual customers, and we want to understand how these customers behave differently, but we want to keep that in the forecast. And as a trade-off, these forecasts are much more sensitive to error because I'm trying to reflect much more granularly what each customer is doing. And if I have a mistake or a certain bias in the forecast, that typically doesn't average out because I'm not having the opposite effect elsewhere and adding it up as I do in the bulk power system. Another key difference is that the loads in the bulk power system tend to be larger, even the ones that I'm not aggregating. There are many large customers or large manufacturing facilities, now data centers, that are showing up and connecting. And the fact that these loads are larger means that my traditional customer segments, in the sense of clustering all my residential customers in a single residential segment, tend to be sufficient to represent how those customers tend to behave. In contrast, in the distribution system, loads are much smaller. And then even traditional customer segments like residential tend to be too big and not descriptive of what actually is represented in that particular load forecast. So we can see distribution system planners that are using much more nuanced labels to describe specific subsegments of residential customers that have perhaps different purchasing power, different preferences, etc. One key difference now in respect to uncertainty is the fact that in the bulk power system, the larger loads are visible. Typically, you don't get a data center that can just plug into an outlet and start consuming. They require and they have to follow an interconnection procedure that renders their request of interconnection quite clearly visible to the bulk power system owner or the utility that's planning, and hence it can be incorporated in the load forecast with more certainty. In contrast, many of the loads, especially the new loads that exist in distribution systems, are invisible. They do not require a permit or a warning to the utility. And indeed, in many cases, you can install, for example, EV charging equipment and plug your EV without really telling your utility. So the utility has to be scouting for these new emerging patterns of behavior that describe new types of loads being added. And in doing that, bringing more uncertainty to the forecast. Finally, the load aggregation and the bulk power system requires more careful treatment of randomness. The fact that you're aggregating loads that actually are behaving differently has the benefit that I mentioned, that on average or an expectation, you can coalesce to a certain medial value, but the tails of those distributions can be quite big, and hence the Bell system has to focus on the stochastic behavior of these loads because of those tails, and ensure that they're planning for that worst case scenario, and in doing that, developing and using this forecast for resource adequacy in addition to just planning for future resources. In the distribution system, the smaller loads are such that they can be treated deterministically, in part also because the distribution system planning tends to be of a shorter time frame. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to reiterate a few things that Allison said in terms of what are common load forecasting practices that we see in both bulk power systems and distribution systems. So one leading practice that we see now in both is the fact that they're developing hourly load forecasts. Both in the bulk power system, these load aggregations, even though they're spatially aggregated, they remain or they have been trending to develop hourly patterns. You can see here to the right a Seattle City Lights 2022 IRP that had developed these daily, hourly shapes that were representative and used to describe load patterns in their service territory. The idea of this hourly load forecast is that they can capture diurnal versus nocturnal profiles. They can capture seasonal patterns in behavior, so they're hourly in an 8760 fashion, meaning that they span the whole year. And they can also describe not only peak demand needs, but also daily and weekly energy needs that are important as we have more battery storage showing up both in bulk power system as well as distribution systems. Ideally, load forecasts will match the spatial unit of analysis, and we see this also as a common practice in load forecasts. So whatever is your bulk power system and your distribution system minimum unit of analysis, all models used in those are trying to follow what the load forecast is establishing to get them all consistent in their inputs and their outputs. This also allows to better represent load in reliability assessment models. This is exclusively for bulk power systems by capturing probabilistic and statistical properties that are assigned to specific units of analysis at the spatial level, meaning a node or a balancing area or a subregion within the bulk power system. Next slide. Now, even with those common traits that we see, there are specific aspects for distribution and bulk power systems. So I'm going to start with distribution system. The emphasis in distribution system remains on the peak demand, trying to find what is the peak local demand. I will emphasize local here because typically the distribution system level is planning at a feeder level, as I mentioned here. So the forecasts are developed at a feeder level, and sometimes even for really large feeders, they're developed at a sub-feeder level. So these forecasts are bottom up. They're based on typically on customers. In the past, they used to be econometric forecasts, like Allison described. They used to be based more on historical behavior, but with large changes in customer preferences and types of end users, this is changing towards a more engineering bottom-up basis. The forecast typically span 3 to 5 years, which is a usual planning period for distribution systems. And more recently, this forecast at the distribution system level have been much more focused on considering and trying to represent distributed energy resource adoption and operation. They are starting to consider retail rate impacts, so making some assumptions about customers that are migrating out of the traditional volumetric rate and into time of use rates or other types of time varying rates, such that those might shape their load, and then they should be translated into inputs to the load forecast, as well as internalizing flexibility patterns, even though flexibility can be treated as a resource in planning processes. At the distribution system level, remains a property that you want the load forecast to reflect for simplicity. And so again, those load forecasts have to include customers that are enrolled in different types of programs that reward flexibility behavior, flexible behavior responsive to demand response events, etc. Next slide. On the bulk power system level, the emphasis in both on energy and demand. So on the energy side, the bulk power system has to ensure that there are enough resources to supply energy. It's not only supplying capacity in the peak demand, but also supply energy for daily needs. The energy forecast tends to be a deterministic forecast, but typically has several scenarios, usually a high and a low, or scenarios that are driven by certain policy or economic indicators. On the demand side, the demand forecast drives capacity needs and reliability targets, and typically is stochastic. And a best practice, the peak demand comes or emerges from a stochastic analysis. And you can see here to the right in this representation of distribution, probability distributions, the right-hand side is load. And you can see that load is represented by a wider range of possible realizations that depend on weather patterns, customer patterns, etc. And those are important to capture at the bulk power system level, in part because of the implications of shortfalls at the bulk power system level that can ripple into large blackouts. Load forecast scenarios in the bulk power system are developed using possible futures, as I mentioned, including economic growth, end-use adoption patterns, potential existing or potential policies that are being foreseen. And so these different scenarios are encompassing of wide areas, sometimes entire states. With this, there is still an emerging focus on some individual large loads, especially data centers. So load forecasters are now mapping and tracking interconnection requests. They're trying to manage speculation in some of these loads that are shopping for connection points in different parts of the system, even though there's a single load that will actually realize. And there are some early attempts to provide probabilistic approaches for these energy needs from larger loads. This is an example from Georgia Power, which is trying to assign a probability for the load to show up in their service territory and a probability for the load to actually reach commercial stage. And with those, multiplying those, having a sense of the likelihood of the particular growth they are forecasting. Next slide. Now, the historical divide that exists and the way bulk power system and distribution system forecasts have operated differently is starting to be blurred. This is in part because some jurisdictions are testing, generally the behest of the regulators, different types of integrated system planning approaches that are connecting what used to be separated planning processes. In addition, we have FERC Order 2222, which is encouraging and or requiring ISOs and RTOs to facilitate the ways in which distributed energy resources or demand-side resources can participate in wholesale markets by removing barriers and ensuring transparency and equal participation to the supply side resource equivalents. So this is increasing there's an increasing number of bulk power system forecasts that are resulting from aggregations of feeder level load forecasts that are essentially looking at the distribution system plan and building from that to bring it up to the bulk power system level. This is particularly common in vertical integrated utilities that do not participate in ISO RTO territory that have a full control of the value chain. The bulk power system load forecasts are starting to trend into what the distribution systems have done in terms of modeling the ER adoption and operation and becoming much more granular. And then distribution system forecasts are, on the other hand, moving to longer planning horizons that are starting to look like bulk power systems. They're starting to focus more on scenario-based planning, which they didn't used to do maybe a decade ago or less. And they're slowly considering the development of some stochastic approaches to represent load growth uncertainty in specific feeders. Next slide. I'm going to finalize here. I'm going to finish with a couple of examples of how this convergence is starting to occur. For example, in California, a few years ago, there was a CPUC rulemaking that required the use of a single forecast that would be used for all integrated resource planning processes, resource adequacy programs, and distribution planning. So this would be a very detailed forecast at the customer level And those aggregations that would be done to create higher level forecasts about our system would be all consistent with a single, very granular forecast that would ensure that all these processes are using the same inputs and assumptions. Similarly, Duke Energy in the Carolinas developed an integrated and system operations planning process, is ISOP, which is a planning framework that is optimizing capacity and energy resources across the value chain. And in doing this, the utility developed a bottom-up hourly detailed forecast at the circuit level that they call Morecast, that they're using for distribution system planning and holds the promise to be used in the same way as in California to go up to the bulk power system in aggregation. I think with that, in the next slide, I'm gonna pass it to Brittany.
Thank you, JP. So I'm going to build on the examples that JP was just sharing and talk about some best practices and how load forecasting feeds into utility decisions. Next slide, please. So today, my presentation is going to focus on best practices, as I mentioned, when it comes to forecasting load and distributed energy resources. I'm going to include some examples of those best practices, some challenges and limitations, as well as how load forecasts feed into utility decisions, including planning for resource adequacy. I also wanted to point out that these slides reference materials from other presentations given by the national labs. These are great resources and they're provided here for your reference. And as a quick note, throughout this presentation, you'll see links to supplemental documentation. So if you want more information, you can access the link. Next slide, please. To compile best practices for you, we reviewed filings from 9 leading utilities where we examined the methods and tools used for conducting granular load forecasting and the methods and tools used for conducting distributed energy resource forecasting. So when I talk about forecasting, I wanted to point out that it's really the gross load or what customers are using. And then there are the behind the meter distributed energy resources that we have to take into account. So the net load is what the utilities have to serve. So it's also important in that context to understand what the DER forecast is. Next slide, please. Some current best practices when it comes to load forecasting are that utilities are increasingly moving toward more granular forecasts, and JP had mentioned this as well. And in particular, we see that on the distribution system. And when discussing granularity, I do mean that forecasts are moving to be more granular in time and in space. So we see some of the more advanced utilities moving toward forecasting for every hour of the year. That's the 8760 hours per year. And then looking at the circuit level rather than larger geographic regions. I also wanted to share some of the tools that these more advanced utilities are using. They include LoadSeer for more granular load forecasting. SIMDIST and Synergy are some of the more advanced power flow modeling tools that can be used for evaluations, but they can also be used for forecasting. GridLab-D is a lab-developed tool for open source power flow simulation. And there are also econometric models and probabilistic forecasting methods, as Allison described earlier today, that can also be used. And so I also wanted to point out that as we looked at some of these more advanced methods for this review, we realized that a lot of these methods do start with what we would call planner's judgment or corporate forecasts from utilities. So as some of you are engaged in the dockets and planning activities, that may be an area for you to have some discovery on. That is, what are the company projections that are providing the basis for some of these forecasts and then are used for the inputs for these forecasting tools. And then I did also want to highlight, as JP mentioned, that an interesting model is the California Energy Commission's Integrated Energy Policy Report, where the California Energy Commission determines a forecast for the state, and then the utilities work with that forecast for their planning. Next slide, please. So on the DER forecast side, we are seeing that some utilities are using econometric models where they look at the historic relationship between DER adoption and other economic variables like population and income to understand that correlation and forecast future adoption. Some utilities use innovation of diffusion curves like the Bass diffusion model. And if you look at the figures on the right-hand side of the slide, there is this diffusion of innovation where things start out slow and then they ramp up and then it levels off again. So this kind of innovation of diffusion curve is used to understand the adoption of many types of technologies, and it's used for projecting that adoption to different distributed energy resources. The types of tools that are being used for distributed energy resource forecasting are the same tools as mentioned before, such as GridLab-D and LoadSeer. Those are commonly used for DER forecasting. Next slide, please. For the specific methods used in DER forecasting, some utilities start with a top-down system-level projection and then disaggregate that to a more granular level. And there are different ways to do that disaggregation. For example, some disaggregation techniques include proportional allocation, where the DER forecast is disaggregated to the circuit level based on utility data for the circuit, including load or energy or number of customers. There are propensity models, which base the disaggregation on a propensity score, which is typically determined by customer characteristics using econometric methods. And then there are the adoption models, which I described previously, where the DER forecast is based on an adoption forecast. But in general, as utilities have more granular data about their system, they can do more granular load forecasting. But one thing to keep in mind that is, as a utility wants to obtain this more granular data, it's not free. Sensors need to be deployed on the systems, but it does enable more granular forecasting. And as a quick reminder, what I've shared here is just a really brief glimpse into some best practices. And our multi-lab team will provide a deeper dive on developing forecasts for load expansion with JP and on distributed energy resources. So please plan on tuning into those webinars for more information on those topics. Next slide, please. Next, I wanted to provide a quick example of best practices, and this example is from National Grid. So since 2018, National Grid has been generating these 8760 hourly forecasts by feeder for their service territory. And these forecasts are used for local area planning assessments, but they're also used to identify where non-wires alternatives might be useful. They're using an open source power flow model, GridLab-D, to look at developing these feeder profiles, and then they're using cloud computing to help with the overall computational process. They're using the EV model Polaris to simulate EV charging behaviors, and then they're using the annual peak load forecast to incorporate projected economic and demographic impacts, as well as anticipated technological advances and policy objectives. And then they've noted for the future that future enhancements will incorporate probabilistic forecasting techniques. And this is a common thread that we've heard, that instead of just having a deterministic look at this is what we think the future will bring, they're looking at forecasts that look at different probabilities of different potential futures. Next slide, please. So in terms of limitations, data availability is the biggest challenge that we've seen from different utilities as they consider moving into more detailed or more granular forecasting. A lot of utilities identify that they'll need more granular data, more monitoring systems. And again, that data isn't free. It's the more sensors have to be put on the system. So that really is the biggest challenge that we've heard. There also can be some issues around data quality. And I have an example here from a New York utility where they talk about how the system is set up for load transfers, which allows them to transfer load from one circuit to another if there's an issue. But that can create data quality issues when looking back at the data. It's hard to understand whether it was an actual load transfer or load decrease or load growth on different circuits. So these types of challenges relate to data, and they apply to more granular load forecasting. And then another challenge identified is the need for this more probabilistic forecasting, considering these different future scenarios. And that's just a challenge that utilities are also dealing with. Next slide, please. So last, I wanted to discuss how load forecasting feeds into different utility decisions. So if you were able to catch our first webinar, Juliet and Aran gave a great overview of how load forecasting feeds into utility decisions. So this will be a recap for those of you that were able to make that webinar, but for those of you unable to make it, we'll just do a quick recap. And as a note, that training will be made available as well. So to recap, load forecasting feeds into a number of utility decisions, from transmission planning to resource adequacy evaluation to resource planning to rate design. In transmission and distribution planning, load forecasts are critical for determining how much and what type of infrastructure is needed to reliably deliver electricity from suppliers to end-use consumers. So in that context, forecasts can inform the size of transmission lines, substations, distribution feeders. They can determine hosting capacity, etc. In resource adequacy evaluations, load forecasts are critical for determining whether available generation and reserves will be sufficient to meet projected demand and to maintain those required planning margins. And then in resource planning, load forecasts guide capacity and operational planning by identifying the amount and the timing of new generation and the resources needed to reliably meet that future demand. And then you can see that load forecasts so when they inform transmission planning and resource adequacy and resource planning, these pieces together guide utility investment decisions, and that helps reshape the rate design needed to recover costs and allocate those costs fairly across customers. So load forecasting is an incredibly important piece of utility decision making. And next, I want to share some resources for more information for those of you that are interested. And then next slide, please. Last, I'll transition to my colleague, Pete, to discuss the technical assistance program.
Thanks, Brittany, Allison, JP, great job today. Yeah, thanks. Just wanted to make you all aware, this webinar series is actually funded through the Department of Energy, but it's being done as a technical assistance request. We had a number of requests from a number of states on these issues of load forecasting and resource adequacy. And so we provided this workshop to meet that need. So we urge all of you listening, if you come from a public utility commission or from a state energy office, opportunity to get direct technical assistance from folks like Brittany, JP, Allison, and others in the lab complex on load forecasting, resource adequacy topics, among a host of others, is available to you through the URL listed on the left-hand side. You can also access that URL through the QR code. There's 3 types of technical assistance the program offers. The simplest one is basically you get 4 hours of access to people like Brittany, JP, and Allison. Quick phone call, you have some questions, maybe they have a pre-canned presentation that they can provide to you on a topic of interest to you. Very simple intake form available on the website to gain access to that type of technical assistance. Next up, we move all the way up to about 100 hours. There certainly have the opportunity for one of these subject matter experts to provide much more deep and robust analysis, along the lines of these technical assistance requests. And so again, it's very simple in terms of accessing it. There's an intake form, about 4 or 5 questions. Main one being, what do you need help with? And then we can identify who might be a good subject matter experts to connect you with. And within a week, you should be off and running. Last but not least is our deep dive. These are typically TA requests that can span 6 to 9 or maybe even 12 months, cover a wide range of topics. Usually deep analysis is required to support the requests. We get involved in supporting regulatory proceedings, whether that's beforehand or during in some of these load forecasting or resource adequacy arenas. We may support the commission as they are reviewing IRPs or other types of utility filings. Unfortunately, at this time, this is not available. We're hoping that in the next federal funding cycle, money will be made available so we can open the application process for that once again. So please look back at, circle back to that URL, statetaprogram.lbl.gov, for more information on the deep dive. But if you have more immediate needs, please feel free to access either our help desk or expert match. And so with that, I want to thank you all for joining today. Here's the contact information for our 3 wonderful lab presenters today. If you have any questions on what you heard, please feel free to reach out. As you saw, at the very beginning of the presentation, there are a number of other webinars on this topic that are currently being held, but are also being recorded. So check back onto the website and gain access to the recordings of those if you're not able to attend them in person. So with that, thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.